Well, good morning, and we might get started, and as we're now a few minutes past the hour. So welcome to EMPRA's April 2023 webinar. I'm today coming to you from the lands of the Tharawal people in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. My name is Phil Campbell, and I'm the co-chair of the EMPA Australia 2023 conference. And on behalf of EMPA, I'd like to welcome everyone here today, and particularly those who are joining us from right across Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world. Welcome. Now, I'm very excited to introduce to you today today's speaker, who'll be one of the international keynotes at the upcoming EMPA Australia conference in June, Shel Bratas. Shel has worked with crisis communication. Oh, there he is. Hello, Shel. Crisis communication and victim support on some of the biggest crises hitting Norway. He's had central positions after the tsunami in Asia in 2004, including weekly meetings of survivors and next of kin, and organising travels back to Thailand in 2005. After the terrorism attacks on Oslo and Utøya in July 22nd, 2011, he worked with media handling, internal communication, and next of kin support. He assisted at the Media Centre and was in charge of social media monitoring during visits to Utøya in August for survivors and family members. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, Shel headed up a group of communications advisors from various ministries and the Office of the Prime Minister who worked on social media and crisis communication. Shel gives lectures and presentations in Norway as well as internationally, and of course is coming out to our EMPA conference. He's presented at the National Emergency Planning College, the Norwegian Communication Society, the World Conference on Disaster Management in Toronto on multiple occasions, the Intermedic Summit in Denver, and the YATA Conference on Crisis Communications and Social Media in Istanbul. In 2019, he was a keynote speaker at our EMPA conference on crisis communications in Sydney, and in the summer of 2022 was invited to be a member of an expert group organised by Interpol, which focused on crisis communication at large sporting events. Shel's been a guest lecturer at the University of the Arctic, Inland Norway University, Leiden University in the Netherlands, Griffiths University in Brisbane, and Lund University in Sweden. He's a member of the Humanitarian Assistance and Psychosocial Support subgroup of the Counter-Terrorism Preparedness Network. Shel, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing many of you in Brisbane in June.
Shel, I understand that for that conference in June, you're going to be basing your keynote presentation on your PPC model, People, Planning and Communication. Can you tell us why you think these topics are so important?
Yes, I see these as three different circles that interact somehow, and I can give you just a few examples of why I think this is important. And of course, people, I think that people should always come first when you're thinking about crisis communication and handling a disaster, because everything has to do with people. And after a disaster or a crisis, there are always people involved. And I think it's our job as communicator to try to do our best to make their situation as good as possible in a very, very difficult situation. So that's why I think we really need to think that it's people involved and we have to do what we can to communicate in a proper way. My second kind of circle has to do with planning, and I will be talking lots about that when I come to Brisbane in June. And it's my experience that quite a lot can be done in advance when you're planning for an event or planning for something that's gonna happen. And if you have planned in advance and thought quite well about what could happen, then it's easier to handle it if something happens. And I'm a big believer in scenarios, and we do that quite often at work. And I'm now involved in writing Norway's first plan for crisis communication after a possible major aviation disaster. And then we look at various disaster scenarios and see what would be the playbook, what would happen after something has happened. And we can learn a lot from that. And I think that by thinking of scenarios, there are many ways we can be prepared and handle the situation in a better way. And I believe too that thinking of scenarios, it doesn't have to be very costly, or you don't need to involve lots of consultants, for example. You can just sit down with a group of key people and have a kind of a tabletop exercise, for example, where you think about what could happen, what would be the worst kind of scenario, and how would we handle it, who would we need to help with that, and maybe have some meetings in advance with the people who will be involved in handling such a crisis situation. And then, of course, I think it's important in the planning process to always have some kind of exercise to see for yourself how your plan would work out, what you need to think about and who you need to cooperate with. And maybe, as I said, have meetings with them in a normal times, and then be able to plan much better. My last point has to do with communication, and that's of course my profession. So I think it's very, very important, and I have a lot of experience with that. And I think you need to, again, plan for the communication phase. You need to think about the various stakeholders that you will be communicating with, and also how they will interact with each other. And look at, for example, what kind of channels we will be using and what are the best means of communicating after a crisis has happened. And it has to do, of course, with saying the right words, having the right tools, and also thinking about what you will say, and telling people that you have to be honest. And sometimes it can be very emotional processes that they have to go through, but that also can be thought of in advance. So I think these are the three main points, and sometimes they will interact, and sometimes, of course, planning has to do with communication. Sometimes planning has to do with a human aspect, and you need to really look at these three circles together.
Yeah, thanks, Kel. That's such good advice. And as someone who's done quite a lot of that sort of planning myself in previous roles that I've had, one of the things that I learned was it's so important to test that technology as well, to make sure that the technology is going to work on the day. That it's one thing to have all the messaging ready to go, but the technology doesn't work when it needs to work. That's a matter as well. So important to make sure that all of those processes and procedures are all in place, the technology is ready, as you say, and that you've got all the messaging well in advance and you've tested everything. So vitally important. One of the things I've noticed that you're going to be speaking about at the conference, and I'm very excited to hear it when you get over here to Brisbane, is the role of communicating public safety at major international sporting events. As you know, Australia is a great sporting nation, as is New Zealand. We have many New Zealand delegates watching in today as well, and making sure that people are communicated with at these big events is really important. And of course, the biggest of all is coming up in Australia quite soon, which is the Olympics in 2032 in Brisbane, as well as the Women's World Cup Soccer in a few months. Tell us a little bit about communication, please, at events. Over to you, Kel. Sorry, frog in my throat.
Yes, I will talk about quite a few different sporting events when I come over to Brisbane, and look at what we can learn from past events. And as some of you may know, Norway actually hosted the Winter Olympics back in 1994. So that's a long time ago. And at that time, I was actually a student in Texas, in Austin, Texas. So I didn't follow it personally in Norway. But I know that they had, of course, even at that time, quite a few challenges with communication planning. And one example that wasn't really a crisis, but something that showed that you can never plan for everything. And that had to do with a kind of a scandal that happened with the ice skating competition, where Nancy Kerrigan, as some of you might have heard about, was kind of attacked by a woman named Tonya Harding, both of them from the States. And we saw in the States and in Norway that this story became the main story for many, many days. And there were a big scandal, and that was all that the newspapers and the media were covering at the Olympics in Norway for several days. And of course, that's something that never could have been planned for, but it just shows that you really have to think that anything can happen and be prepared for that. I will also going to talk about a much more tragic event that happened in England back in 1989, where there was a soccer match at the Hillsborough Stadium. I'm sure many of you have heard about that, where there was a crowd crash and the police did not handle the situation very well because lots of people were coming into a small area, and actually 97 people died during that crowd crash. And there's quite a lot we can learn from that. Also the follow-up, which was really not handled in a good way, because we found out later, and many years later, that the police did not tell the truth about how they had handled the situation. And for the first weeks and the first years even, the government officials and the police officials were blaming the Liverpool soccer fans for being unruly and for having fake tickets, etc. And they, of course, took that very personal. And it was a very big problem in all of the United Kingdom. And actually, just a few years ago, or maybe this year, the police came out. There were several evaluations afterwards, and the police admitted that they had not handled the situation well at all, and they made a public apology so many years after. Another event that I will also mention that could have been a disaster but wasn't was a large soccer game that took place in the Stade de France outside of Paris just last year. And again, it was actually Liverpool, the soccer club that was part of that. And again, we saw that the police and emergency managers had not planned very well how people would be moving towards the stadium. And there were lots of crashes going on, lots of tear gas being used, and many of the fans were attacked by local gangs while they were trying to get into the stadium. And we saw then too, and this was just last year, as I mentioned, that the police tried to blame the soccer fans, and it took several weeks and lots of journalists to uncover the truth that they hadn't planned it well, and they hadn't thought about the crowd situation that you always need to think about, of course, when you're planning such a big event. I also think that we can learn from other types of crises that have not just happened in the sporting events, but also at concerts. And they are quite similar in many ways. And there are, of course, and I'm sure you know, many concerts where there have been problems and where they haven't thought in advance about how to communicate if something happens. And finally, I'd like to just point out that I think crowd control is something that we really need to think about, and we need to think about how we do the communication part of that.
Thanks, Kel. Sorry, everyone. Before I've had COVID recently, so I had to have a little cough. Following on from that, Shell, we've got, as I said, the Women's World Cup soccer coming up in Australia just on the 20th of July. This is the kickoff, so very soon. And not too many years before the city of Brisbane is holding the 2032 Olympics. So what lessons from the past do you think Australia can learn going forward, looking at those two sporting events in terms of communicating and making sure that people are safe and have a good time at those events?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, that we can plan quite a lot in advance. And as I mentioned right now, the part of the crowd control, how pedestrians will be moving, that is something that you really need to think about also in communication terms. And you need to think about just basic things like signage, how to give vital information during an event, and also how you will handle if something happens. And for communication purposes, I think it's very important also to decide in advance what kind of channels we'll be using, what kind of channels are the crowd people represented in the crowd using. Is it Twitter? Is it Facebook? Is it Instagram? Is it TikTok? Is it just messages on a billboard? How you do that is also important to think about in advance. And again, learn from the past events that we have discovered that people didn't do it the right way.
Keller, how do you also deal with those sorts of big international events where you've got people from multiple countries speaking different languages? So how do you make sure that you're reaching all of the people that you need to reach in a way that they can understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, again, something that we need to think about in advance. And I think in those situations, you need to talk to the right people, of course, and have people who can help you to communicate first with local groups and see if they maybe have interpreters or people who can bring your message forward in the right language. And maybe sign language is one way to do it, and really do that kind of planning.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Kel. You know, one of the things you'll be doing at the EMPA conference is running a workshop as well as being our keynote speaker, for which we're very grateful. I believe your workshop's going to have quite a practical approach. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about at that workshop? And for those who may not be able to make the conference, just give a few little insights that might be of use for them.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to running the workshop. It's about 3 hours, I believe, on the last day of the seminar, and that will focus on the aftermath of a disaster and the crisis communication part of that. And as you mentioned, it will have a very practical approach. I will give many examples from my own experience, both from the tsunami back in 2004, but also we learned quite a bit during and after the terror attacks in Oslo and on Utøya in 2011. And so I will be focusing on those. And I have developed another kind of a very small model, but which is just a timeline, where I look at what needs to happen right after a disaster has occurred. And then I look at what happens in the first weeks and the first months afterwards, and then what happens in the first year, and then what happens in the following years. And again, many of those subjects can be planned for in advance, because we know from the past that they occur again and again and again. And for example, right after something has happened, you need to have good systems for what in the States at least is called victim accounting. You need to find out what has happened to everyone involved. Where are they? Which hospitals are they being treated at? How do we communicate with the families, for example, about that? I will also give many examples about how to run a family assistance center, which is a center that is usually set up to help communicate with those who are directly affected and their families. And there are many, many lessons learned from past experiences that I will cover during the workshop. And then as we move on in the timeline, there are other aspects as well. For example, we've seen again and again that people want to have some kind of a memorial service, and the 1 year mark is very, very important. And that is something that you have to plan for and really think about the communication aspect of that. We have also seen, for example, site visits. It's always important for family members to try to come back or to visit as close as possible to where their family member was when he or she died during the event that you are working on. And as you mentioned, I did that kind of work after the tsunami in Thailand, where the Norwegian government organized 2 trips back to Thailand for family members. And that was a big challenge. We had more than 200 people on each trip, and there were lots of also crisis communication challenges that I want to cover and talk about and discuss during this workshop. And finally, we'll be looking at what happens in the following years and in the years after, and that can have to do with, for example, court cases that come up. There might be movies or documentaries that are being made about the event, and there will always be some kind of a memorial service. And that can be, as I said, after 1 year, but also after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe 50 years after. People still want to have some kind of commemoration for what happened. And we as communicators need to help that happen as well as possible.
Well, I know, Shell, that we had a train disaster at Granville back in, I think, 1977 or 78, and there's a memorial service still held every year for the 80-odd victims of that particular disaster. So, as you say, those memorial services can go a very, very long time past. Shell, how do you reconcile in these sorts of situations the non-government organisations who may want to become involved with this, with the more formal communications organisations like government agencies?
I can give some examples when we come to the workshop about how that has been done in other countries and in Norway. We have a very good experience with working with the Red Cross, for example. But it's very important to define roles, to say that this is what the government should do, this is what the private company should do, and this is what the Red Cross volunteers can do and what they can communicate about. And that needs to be discussed, of course, ideally before something happens, so that everyone stays within their role and we don't have discussions in the open about who should say what. And there is quite a lot we can learn from that, I think.
And I believe there's also much we can learn from aviation disasters as well. Is that right?
Yes, and I have studied many aviation disasters, and I'm now working on Norway's national plan for crisis communication after an aviation disaster. And unfortunately, there is lots to learn from that kind of situations, because in the past there have been many disasters in the aviation industry. And sometimes it has been handled in a good way. And there are also many examples of how people have not been treated in the right way, or how crisis communication has not worked in the right way. And another challenge for that special aviation group is that the social media plays a very important role. And we have seen, for example, that many flights now have internet on board. And when there is a crisis happening on the plane, people are sending out messages. And sometimes they are sending messages that they believe will be the last message that they will ever send in their life. So they are very emotional. And that makes many challenges for the airline, for example, which is never able to be on top of the situation, because people are telling live what's happening on board. So you need to plan for that and have systems so that you can, for example, monitor social media and find out as soon as possible when someone is talking about your company.
Just a reminder to everybody that we'd love to have your questions come through so I can pass those on to Shell. So if you could hop into the chat. There's nobody who's put any questions up at this time, but we'd love to have some questions. So please hop onto the chat, into the Q&A rather. If the Q&A is not working for you, drop an email to High Profile, as I mentioned before. Otherwise, I'll keep an eye on the chat if you just can't get into the email, and look for questions in there too. But we really warmly encourage you to throw any questions you want to at Shell, and use this wonderful opportunity while we've got such an expert with us to pick his brain, as we say in English. Shell, you mentioned before a practical approach. Can you give us any hints or advice about the sorts of tools that might help us in that regards?
Yes, I was thinking at the end of the workshop, we will talk a little bit about the tools of the trade, so to speak. And I try to do that in a very practical way, and talk about, of course, just the traditional tools that we have, for example, using press releases or press conferences. And they, in my opinion, they still work. And we have seen, and I have experienced that, for example, just telling people that there will be a press conference can help the communications department, because then there are fewer journalists calling in, because they know that they will get some kind of information, for example, in 3 hours. And then they can have their questions answered there by people who are in authority to speak. And that's always what they want, of course. I also want to talk, as I mentioned, quite a bit about social media, which of course are very, very important, and more important now than in many of the crises that I have worked with in the past. But we really need to be in top of those kinds of tools, and have tools, as I mentioned, for monitoring social media, not just in a crisis, but in a regular day. You need to have tools for monitoring social media. And I also want to talk about just simple things like how do we make a map? How can we use tools on the web, for example, to present to the public maps that give information that might be vital for saving lives, or for getting out of a dangerous situation. And there are many tools we can use that are free, and that people maybe don't think about that we can use for that. And also talk about how to make video messages, for example. I mentioned the aviation industry, and we saw, I think, a very good example after the terrible Germanwings accident that you might remember, when the plane from Germanwings flew into a mountain and everyone died. And it was Germanwings is a company owned by Lufthansa, and right after it had happened, on the same day, Lufthansa published a message from the head of the company, the CEO, and he was very honest, he was very emotional, and he was giving the kind of information that he could give out in a very, very passionate way. And that's an example, I think, of using free tools. It's very easy, of course, to just use your iPhone to make such a video recording and then publish it on a YouTube channel. That is also free. So there are many ways you can do that, and you can get your message across by using tools like that. And finally, of course, I really want to talk a little bit about what everyone is talking about right now, artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, for example. And many people are very afraid of it. And I think it's very, very scary to see what those kinds of tools can do. But they can also be very helpful. And I've looked quite a bit into that. And for example, had ChatGPT write messages that can be used as a media statement, or use ChatGPT to provide difficult questions from a journalist, so that you can prepare for that in advance. And of course, this is a situation that is evolving as we speak, and there are new tools coming out, and many people are very, very scared and skeptical. But I believe that we really need to embrace even those kinds of new tools, and talk about that too during the workshop.
That's really interesting, Shell. My daughter, in fact, is about to do a PhD in archaeology using artificial intelligence to look for archaeological sites. So the implications of ChatGPT and particularly AI, are very far-reaching, and it's good to see that there's potentially some positive benefits for us in the media and communication sphere. we'll wrap up shortly and then take some questions. But so I guess on to the big picture, Shell. What do you see as the big picture in terms of the communication as you've been talking about today?
Wow, that's a big question,
Yes.
of course. And again, I want to emphasize that we have to think about the people involved. We have to have a focus on those who have been directly involved and discuss in advance how can we best communicate with them. What kind of information do they need? What can we prepare for in advance? What do we have to say at the right time and at the right moment? And how do we present in an honest way in a difficult situation? And as I said, I also think the big picture now has to do with being more aware of what kind of information we get from social media. And we talked about ChatGPT, for example, that can provide lots of text information. But as I'm sure many of you know, there are now many tools out there that can produce images or even videos that might be real or look very real, but they are fake, and they provide what could be considered a fake news. And we need to be even more prepared now to be able to try to spot what is fake and what is the real thing, and be very, very certain that we talk about the right stuff based on the right information, and not base it on fake news that come out through those kinds of means. And I think too that we will discuss in Brisbane that many of the challenges we face in our communication fields are the same across the world. And I think that many of the challenges we have in Norway are the same challenges that you guys have in Australia. And it's going to be very interesting to discuss that much further.
And Shell, I'm assuming too, of course, that given what you've just said, training your staff members or team members is of really considerable importance as well, isn't it?
Yes, and as I said, I'm very focused on how you can do it practically, because if you say that you have to do training that's very costly, then often the CEO or the management says that no, there will not be such a crisis happening, and we will not pay for that. But I think you can do a lot just by having tabletop exercises, just bringing people together before something happens and have 2-hour discussions about how we would handle one of the scenarios that we have developed.
Shell, we've got a couple of questions that have begun to come through, so I'll read the first of those. So this comes from Rowena Christensen. She said, I'm wondering how much of a lasting impact the terror attacks in Norway have had to the present day, and also how this has affected the approach to emergency management and response and anticipation of attacks. Lone wolves can be hard to detect, but have advances been made with monitoring and social media, etc.? And she said, Tusen tak. So I guess she's one of your countrymen.
Yes, she knows Norwegian. That's great. Well, that's a great question. And that could, of course, be its own talk, because there's so much to say about what happened on the 22nd of July, 2011. And I'm not a police person, but I can tell you that quite a lot has happened within the police afterwards, because there was a very thorough after action report that came out that discussed the police response. And of course, as I'm sure many of you know, there were some challenges in the way the Norwegian police responded to that crisis. Not so much in Oslo, but especially out on Utøya, the island. It's a very small island, it's very hard to reach. And it took the police a very long time to get out to the island and get hold of the terrorist. And as you know, he was arrested and he's now in prison, probably for life. But we learned a lot, and the lone wolf phenomenon is, of course, still a very, very important reminder that we have to have tools in place, and the police have to have tools in place to try to find these people. And it's, of course, a very tragic fact that there are copycats. There are people who want to do kind of the same thing. And we saw that in New Zealand, for example, a few years afterwards, that the terrorist in Norway had been an inspiration. And of course, we have to try to avoid that from happening as much as possible. So in Norway, and I've seen in New Zealand too, that there are there's quite a bit of focus on not making him more famous than he needs to be. So we never talk about his name, or we try to avoid using his name, for example, and we try to learn from what happened there.
Our next question comes from Mel Taylor, and she said, in the natural hazards area, floods and bushfires, we're seeing larger, longer, more frequent and concurrent disasters. These result in what are often called unprecedented events. Have you got any insights on how we can plan and exercise unknown, complex combinations of events, and how communicators can convince those managing tight budgets that they should invest in planning for these unforeseen events?
Wow, great question. And again, I think we have to focus on the basics first and look at what we can do that doesn't have to cost a lot of money. And as I mentioned, it could be having a tabletop exercise. It could be just traveling around in the city and talking to the people that we know we will have to deal with if there is a crisis. In Norway, for example, we have done a little bit of work with trying to visit hospitals that will be affected if there is a crisis in that community. And in many cases, of course, especially, for example, after an airline crash, which involves a lot of people, there will be several hospitals handling the survivors. And we have to have systems in place for how to deal with that and how to communicate so that we can tell the people involved and their family members where their loved ones is at that special moment. And again, I think the thought of using scenarios is a good way of approaching it, and also learning from past events. And as I have mentioned, there are many reports out there, usually called after action reports in the States, that it's really worthwhile to read about. For example, I've read quite a few after action reports about mass shootings in the States that sadly happen quite often, and very often at schools. And it's quite surprising, I think, that many of these mistakes that happened in one school will happen in another school 2 or 3 or 4 years after. So we really need to focus on what we can learn from past events and really take that to the people we want to communicate with.
Just a reminder to everybody that if you'd like to submit a question, if you could please do that. We have a further question coming up, but we'll get some space after that. So please take the opportunity while Shell's here. It's 3:30, it's 2:30 in the morning over in Norway at the moment. So, you know, I think while Shell's probably keen to get to bed, he's probably also very keen to hear your questions. So please make use of the opportunity. To which our next question comes from Ewan Hill. Thank you, Ewan. Hi, Shell. Thank you for your time today. And I wholeheartedly endorse the use of maps for displaying easy to consume data. Bob Parker, the Mayor of Christchurch, New Zealand, used the colloquial term munted about his city after the earthquake. Is a good way of defining the status by colloquial expressions, is this a good way of defining the status by colloquial expressions rather than emergency service government speak? So what do you think about that idea, Shell?
If I understand the question correctly, I think it's vital that we talk, of course, in the same language that the people who are listening and the people who the message is designed for. And we learned quite a bit about that when we had the COVID situation in Norway, where at sometimes there was a lot of talk about medicines and medical terms that people just really didn't understand at all. And we got feedback later that we had to really change our wording, change our messaging so that we would reach the right audience. And what we did then that we learned from was to make more use of images. We tried to make small and very simple drawings, for example, that gave very clear advice about, washing hands, etc., etc. And I think in other kinds of crises, we can also do that kind of messaging by having someone make a drawing or using digital tools for making images that can be used together with text, maybe, to give the right and important information to the people involved in it.
Jill, sometimes in disasters, you have the emergency services who can be very reticent to put information out until it's been confirmed. But you've at the same time got social media where people are putting out information that may or may not be true, and often is true because it's live from the scene or from people that they know are live at the scene. How do emergency service agencies make themselves more I suppose, nimble to be able to get information out faster and to meet the demand of people? We've got this competing demand of wanting to make sure as an emergency service agency or the police or similar that it's all correct before we put it out. But we've got this hunger for information from the people and this unsubstantiated information that's out in the community through social. So how do we reconcile those two things, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I think it's of course important to use social media and to have plans for using that. And one way of doing that and being relevant is to have like a bank of messages that are prepared in advance, where you can kind of fill in the blanks for what has happened. And in the aviation industry that I've talked about, the kind of the golden rule there is that if an airline has an emergency or an accident, they should put out the first statement on social media within 15 minutes. So it's a very short time frame. And of course, then you can't, at that time, you can't say very much detail about what has happened, but you will tell the public that you will be a voice. And I think that's very important, that you get the first message across and maybe have just a Twitter message that says that you are aware of what has happened, and then a link to a web page, because of course you can always use a web page in a good way during and after a crisis if you populate it with new information at a constant level.
Yeah.
And also, as I've talked about, have systems for monitoring, and so that you can follow along and correct information if the wrong or fake information comes out on social media. And so you need to have maybe one person or several people watching what comes out on Twitter feeds, and then bring attention to what is right and what is wrong, and point out what is wrong. And we've seen in the States, maybe you've done the same in Australia, that FEMA, the large organization that handles large crises in the States, they sometimes put out what they call a rumor control page, where they list the rumors about a situation and then the correct information, so that they have an updated list of what is the right kind of facts that you have to follow.
Yeah, similarly here in Australia, I think we've borrowed from that television show Mythbusters, and we talk about myth busting.
Yeah.
A few more questions have now come through, which is great. So the next one is from Jacqueline Hewitt. How do we learn from the past, especially in relation to reviews, reports, investigations? It seems many of the same errors in communication and handling of disasters and crises are repeated. Why don't many organisations seem to learn from the past? It's a very good question.
Yes. I think sadly that many of these reports and the media coverage about what happened are not brought to the attention of those who are on the top level of management. And it's easy for someone on a lower level for us to read it, but maybe the top level management don't have access or aren't told about these kinds of reports that are out there. But I believe that we can do our part, we as communicators, in trying to see, decide what are the main learning points, and then bring attention to that also to top management. And it, for example, has to do with always being honest, always saying the truth. And again, we've seen examples of people flat out lying when they are communicating after a disaster. And one example that we'll come back to when I come over to Australia is the school shooting in Uvalde in Texas that happened just last year. when the governor at the press conference was talking very, very nicely and positively about the police response. And he knew, or should have known, that what he said was totally wrong. And of course, when you do that as a top politician or a CEO, you lose trust right away. And people never will have the same kind of trust that they should have had in the first place.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. Further question. We've probably got time for one more. So if anybody else would like to shoot through a question, we'll have time just for one more after this one, I think. Maybe two. Pardon me. This one comes from Rowena Christensen again. Many countries are now experiencing COVID fatigue. I think I am today myself, actually. And uptake of vaccine boosters has declined, although people are still getting sick and dying. In Australia, COVID is the third biggest killer, but is largely being disregarded by the general population. I'm wondering if Norway is experiencing a similar phenomenon, and if so, how has public health emergency messaging been adapted to encourage people to be COVID safe? Many thanks.
We don't have that kind of a problem in Norway right now. We're kind of over COVID here, but we have also learned a lot from how it was handled. And it's actually very interesting to see how Norway and Sweden, the two countries that are very close together and we understand each other's languages, etc., had very different approaches to crisis communication and also how we handle the COVID situation, especially in the first year or so. And in Norway, we introduced very strict rules. We closed down schools, etc. And we had some challenges with how to communicate about that to the public. And in Sweden, they had a very different approach. They didn't close down as much as we did in Norway. And we saw that the Norwegians then had many questions to the Norwegian government about why we did what we did. And the Swedes had a very different approach. And we saw that communicating about that was really vital, and to see what happened in our country kind of next door and learn from that. But we have also seen that the uptake of vaccines has declined in the last few months or so. And we really then need to have reminders out there, and also have the top politicians not forget about it and have them mention it. For example, if they are giving an interview about something different, they can try to mention that again and remind people of the rules that are still in place.
Thanks, Kjell. Kjell, at your presentation you're going to be giving at the conference in a month or so, you'll be focusing, of course, on sporting organisations, but how can the information that you'll be presenting on dealing with major sporting events, how can we transfer those lessons and that information to the world of natural disasters, to the floods, the storms, the tsunamis?
I think there is a lot we can learn from the sporting events that can be translated to other kinds of disasters. And one vital point is, of course, to think about the large numbers of people that might be involved, and how to deal with that, how to communicate about that, and again think about how to get messages across. And that could be the same after a disaster at the sporting events as after this natural disaster, for example. And again, think about the various tools we can use, how we monitor social media, how we use social media, but also not forget traditional media. Because still in Norway, and I think in most parts of the world, traditional media like newscasts are very important for getting vital messages across to a very large audience. And it's easy for crisis communications people, and especially young communications people, to only focus on social media. But I believe we shouldn't do that. We should really have a wider picture and use all the tools available for getting messages across.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kjell. That's exactly right. Well, Kjell, it's bringing us now pretty much to the end of the webinar, and really want to thank you, Kjell, today, and everybody watching. We've had some great questions and observations coming through. We really appreciate, Kjell, you being up in the middle of the night there in Norway. As always, the recording today will be made available to everyone via our website in the next few days. And of course, don't forget to check out all the upcoming EMPA events while you're there. The next webinar is at the end of May, and it'll feature a discussion on the EMPA principle number 6 with a focus on the all too important social media. We're also only about 7 weeks out now from the EMPA conference in Brisbane, and the full program is now online, and it's a really, really good program. I think it's one of the best ever. So really warmly encourage you to go have a look at that. The conference is running from the 7th to the 9th of June, the 7th and the 8th for the conference sessions, and Shell will do his half-day workshop on Friday the 9th. Shell's workshop will be the aftermath of crises, communicating with those affected, and that is free of charge for those delegates attending. So if you attend the conference, stay on for the extra morning and you'll get a fantastic workshop as well. Some of the sessions we've got coming up are, of course, Shell talking about public safety at major international sporting events. And you've just heard from Shell how we can make that relevant to natural disasters and further afield. We've also got Dr. Daniel Aldrich coming from the United States, and he'll be talking on the role of social capital and social infrastructure in shocks and disasters. We've got sessions on mental health, on surge capacity, which is all too important here in Australia. We've got floods and storms that pop up, on recruiting your emergency communications team. We've got sessions on inclusivity for people with disability. We've got Indigenous voices in disaster communications, a few sessions on recovery communications, and of course, social media, and a lot more. And we've also got the EMPA Awards. The EMPA Awards closed only a few days ago. We've got a record 27 entries. So really great going to be seeing what sort of wonderful work's being done in the emergency communication space when we hear the awards and the award winners. So once again, to everybody today, particularly to Shell, thank you so much for giving up your time and coming along. It's been a wonderful presentation from Shell and really interesting. And thank you all for coming along today. Shell, any final words from you?
No, I think this has been great and very, very good questions. And I'm really looking forward to discussing much, much more when we see each other in Brisbane in just a few weeks. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.